Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And just to be absolutely clear, I'm not just about reducing premature mortality within NHS England. It is actually beyond that, although it sometimes feels a bit risky with the changes we've got going on in the organisation at the moment. So, you've had a really good introduction to why we want to provide 7-day services for our patients. And I simply want to build on that and talk to you about the 10 clinical standards that we have developed for acute care that all of us have a responsibility for helping to implement for our patients. We know that we had a 7-day services forum, which Bruce Keogh himself set up early last year. It involved people from different professions and different areas of expertise to try to decide what the issues were and how we could change the problems that we saw because of things like higher mortality for weekend admissions, higher length of stay for admissions late in the week, and a differential level of readmission rates depending on the day of the week you came into hospital. This isn't good enough for our patients. This is simply a graph, don't worry about the figures, a graph relating to the information which you were given previously. This is for elective admissions, so people admitted on a Sunday or a Saturday in particular had a much higher risk of death. It affects the HSMR of the hospital significantly. That's not fair. This rather busy slide shows the number of admissions by day of the week through to the weekend compared with the mortality for those admissions, and this is just for emergencies. So as an emergency admission on a Saturday or Sunday, you can see that your risk of dying is significantly higher than, so if you were going to choose, you'd probably be admitted on a Tuesday. Unfortunately, most people in the emergency situation don't get to choose. Now, what is interesting is there are some published examples of places that have reversed this. And in particular, I'd cite the example from medicine, particularly cardiology in Edinburgh, where they put in a 7-day consultant-delivered service and actually reversed this, flattened the mortality rate so that it was effectively not significantly different between different days of the week. So we know that we can influence this. If we look at the number of senior staff, the y-axis on this is about the weekend hospital standardised mortality rate with the average across the country of 100, and you can see that the hospitals where they have a relatively smaller number of senior staff, that is consultants, they have a higher mortality, and the hospitals with the best number of consultant staff have a lower mortality. The bars don't look very different, but actually, if you look at the confidence intervals on this, you can see that it is significant. So more senior staff equates to, although I don't know that it's causative, but it equates to a better mortality. This one is about the percentage of your doctors that are staff grades, and it's not saying something bad about staff grades, but a hospital that has a higher percentage of staff grades tends to have a lower percentage of higher trainees. So hospitals which have lots of staff grades tend to have a slightly higher mortality. Hospitals with relatively few staff grades tend to have a lower mortality. So there is something about the skill mix of the staff that you've got as well. So, why does this make a difference? Well, we think some of it is about the actual numbers of staff, and that will apply to nursing staff, to allied health professionals, as well as to doctors. There's certainly something about having senior decision makers around who can actually say, yes, this is what we need to do, rather than, well, I'm not sure, let's wait for Monday on the consultant ward round, which is a phrase that many of us will be familiar with. There's also the importance of diagnostic support services, not just to get the scan or the X-ray or whatever, but to get a valid report on that, and other supports, for example, the physiotherapist to mobilise the patient after their hip replacement, a pharmacist to do the medicines reconciliation on an elderly, frail patient who's on multiple drugs, the speech and language therapist to test someone's swallow so that you can actually get them eating and drinking safely and get them going, and so on and so on. So, and of course, there is the primary and community care end of things as well. This has to be a whole system approach. It happens that we started with the acute sector, but we do have to look at the whole system. So we want to reduce the wait for decisions, reduce the wait for tests, reduce the wait for procedures, reduce the wait for people to be allowed to go home, and increase patients feeling that they are actually at the centre of the process of care, and the care is being done for them rather than them fitting in with a rather archaic system. Of course, it's not about doing more things for patients. It's not about more tests or more procedures. It's just about the timeliness of them. And of course, it's about rescuing people from deterioration, which in itself will reduce the risk of dying, the risk of complications, and the associated costs. So what are we actually talking about? Well, we need standards in both primary and secondary care. We developed, first of all, standards for acute care, and I chaired the clinical expert group that developed these last year, and we're now in a position where we've got a timetable for their implementation through the commissioning contracts, which I'll go through with you. And we've also got the Better Care Fund, which is going to support some of the changes. So some of the money in the Better Care Fund should be around delivering the 7-day services that we believe are right for our patients. So let me go through the standards. We wanted to have not too many standards, so we decided 10 would be fine. We wanted to make sure that they were as generic as possible, at least as far as acute services are concerned. And we had patients as well as clinicians involved in developing them. We had input from the Royal Colleges, from people in social services, people in primary care, secondary care, mental health, and so on. We wanted to ensure they were aligned with the 3 standards for consultant-delivered care produced by the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. So top of the list, you've got a copy of these in your packs, I believe. So top of the list is around patient-focused care. We want patient experience to be good at weekends as it is in the week. The second standard is about being seen by a suitable consultant after your emergency admission to hospital. Now, 14 hours sounds like a ridiculously long time, but that is the backstop. Okay, so if you're admitted as an emergency, you should be seen by a relevant consultant as soon as possible, certainly within a few hours if you come in the daytime. The 14 hours backstop is for the person who arrives in hospital at 7:45 at night and gets seen first on the morning ward round. However, on top of that, patients who are severely ill should have a consultant involved in their care within 1 hour of them being recognised. The third standard is about the recognition of the multidisciplinary team's role in developing a care package and implementing that care package for patients. It's all very well a consultant coming up with a diagnosis, but an awful lot of the care for the patient needs to be delivered by people other than the ward nurses. And of course, we mustn't forget that the ward nurses are already there 7 days a week. So it's about the multidisciplinary team and also about the skill mix within that team. We want handovers to be led by a competent decision maker. We don't want the ad hoc handover that happens in the canteen and the registrar might not make it if he's busy, which again is a scenario that some of us recognise. We want a competent senior person leading the handover. We want a system in each organisation. We're not prescribing the details of the system, but a system that the organisation has confidence in regarding the passage of useful, relevant information about patients from one team to the next. We need hospital inpatients to have scheduled 7-day access to diagnostic services, and the capacity has to be appropriate for the demand. I heard recently from a radiologist who said when they're on duty on a Saturday, they're faced with a list of maybe 15 requests for an emergency CT scan that day. They know they can only do 4 or 5. They basically guess from the referral requests which ones really will make a difference to the outcome for that patient. And if that patient was your relative, you'd be horrified about that situation. It's also, of course, not just about CT scans, and I'll show you some data about some of the other diagnostic services later on. Standard 6 is about access to interventions. Now, this can be an operation, it may be interventional radiology, it may be access to ITU, it may be about therapeutic endoscopy. There are a range of interventions which people need. Someone comes in with an arrhythmia and needs pacing. Do you have someone on site who can do the pacing? There's lots of things that we can do to take forward the process of care for patients and reduce their risk. Standard 7 is about having good mental health support, because what we heard from players was that although there was officially access to mental health services for emergency admissions to physical condition hospitals, it wasn't timely. So it's about having timely access for the emergency and the urgent situation, and that has to be 24 hours a day where necessary. Then, in terms of people who've moved on from the acute end of the hospital onto the general wards, they still need to be seen daily by a consultant in order to move forward their process of care, unless there is a really good reason to say that this is their process of care and it's not going to be changed by whether or not the consultant comes. And we have to be very careful with the implementation of that one, because of what we know is the failure to recognise deterioration in patients in some situations where there is not direct consultant input. And of course there are systems that hospitals are starting to put into place now in order to better recognise deterioration and mitigate its effects. All hospitals have things going wrong with patients, whether accidentally or because of the condition of the patient or because of what's being done in the process of care. But the hospital's low mortality rates are those where they recognise that deterioration and act on it quickly. Standard 9 is about the wider care setting, and this was just us drawing attention to the fact that there's no point just sorting out the acute hospital if you don't sort out the whole health system, and I'm sure quite a lot of what you're going to hear today is about the wider healthcare economy. And Standard 10 is about everyone's need to get directly involved in the quality improvement. So frontline staff need to be involved in looking at the outcomes of their care, and trainees need to be appropriately supervised, rather than those of us from clinical professions go back to the feeling that we had when we were trainees and how different it felt when you were on duty on a weekday during daylight hours and when you were on duty at a weekend. That feeling of abandonment in some, that feeling of, oh, I can do whatever I like and it'll be sorted out by the end of the weekend. That was a very loose level of governance compared with what we have during the weekday, and we need to have it consistently good for our patients. So we believe the standards actually work together to drive the process of care for patients. They're all important, but we do have to think in our own local health economy, which are the ones that are most important for us to get in first. This is the situation regarding the commissioning contracts. So year 1 is the year we're in now. So by the end of this financial year, we need each provider organisation to have its own action plan for how it intends to bring in these 10 clinical standards. And that needs to be in the service development and improvement plan part of the contract. In order to develop this action plan, you will need first of all to have done a self-assessment using the NHS IQ tool, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. In the second year, so by the end of 15-16, the aim should be that you will have implemented at least half of those 10 clinical standards, and you should choose locally which are the ones which are most important. Not the ones that are easiest or the ones you can fudge most readily, but the ones that are most important in your healthcare economy. And by March 2017, the intention is that you should have implemented all those standards. And I know it's a really big ask, I know it's difficult, but the standards have come from appropriate expertise, both patients and clinicians, and with a basis in the published evidence. And we know that this will make a difference for our patients. So a lot of today is about us talking together about what can be done to enable us to meet those standards and drive up the quality of care. So what's actually in place? Within NHS England, we run a 7-day services implementation programme board that brings in players that are relevant to helping make this happen. So in the subgroup which David Levy chairs, we have input from Monitor, from the TDA, from Health Education England, from NHS IQ, and the intention is to try to use the levers available to all these players to help local health economies to deliver 7-day services. We know also we have NHS IQ that is supporting the pilots or early adopters, and we'll hear more about those, I think, later on. So IQ have developed an online toolkit which the organisations can use to work out where they are against the standards at the moment and therefore help to develop an action plan going forward. And although the self-assessment toolkit is primarily for the use of the organisation itself and helping the board of the individual organisation to know where it is and how to develop a plan to go forward, inevitably the TDA will be interested to see what you have put in your self-assessment. CQC will be interested in the self-assessment. And of course, if you want to have a relevant action plan by the end of this financial year, you certainly need to have done that baseline self-assessment well ahead of the end of the financial year. We're encouraging organisations to have that self-assessment done by the end of December. So, what are we hearing from the early adopter sites that IQ have been working with? Certainly, they are finding it easier where they have a real integrated approach, where they have regular conversations between the different players, rather than it being a single organisation that says, well, we'll do this and the rest of them can sort themselves out. That doesn't work. The baseline assessment's really important. People were variably aware of those 10 clinical standards, so it's important that we share those and we recognise where they've come from and their validity. They want to know how to. So another reason why we get together on days like this is for people who've actually cracked it for certain particular ways of doing things to share that knowledge and experience with others. And I think you've got some people talking about that this afternoon in the room, which is great. There's clearly a role for culture and leadership in this, because you need senior leaders to step up to the plate and show that they are just as engaged in 7-day services as the people down there on the front line. So I would expect if you are on the silver or gold on-call team in an acute hospital, that sometimes when you're on call at weekends, you are actually there at the front line, talking with the staff, talking with patients to see what's happening. It's not just a question of being on call at the end of a telephone. So it's a challenge for senior leaders in the room. We are, though, talking about 7-day services, not 7-day working. We are not expecting people to turn into superheroes and to do 70 or 80-hour weeks. People who are regularly expected to work at weekends must be given appropriate compensatory time off, and there has to be a negotiation about how this works. And yes, it's difficult, and this is where HR colleagues can be particularly helpful in order to find ways through. I won't go into detail now, but happy to talk about it later. I like this bottom line. There's a typo here. It's about winning the moral argument, but actually it's also about winning the morale argument about it being the right thing to do. And talking to staff who, in organisations who've actually implemented 7-day services, firstly, they feel good about delivering better patient care at weekends and reducing delays. They don't have to keep going back to their patient who's saying, well, when's the consultant coming round? And the member of staff has to say, well, I'm not sure, but it's probably after the weekend. The example I get, I think Robert Winter gave me this, and I think Robert's in the room. He said that they switched to a 7-day service for acute medicine in Cambridge, and they would not go back because they feel they're offering a better service for patients. I give you the example of pharmacists in my own original organisation, the Whittington Trust in North London. They delivered a 7-day service so that they could do medicines reconciliation for ward patients at the weekend. And they said, oh, Mondays are so much nicer now. We don't have a really horrible time with a huge backlog of work to do on Mondays. So they're very happy to have made the change. So, the early adopters, you've got James Paget and South East Essex in this part of the country, but as you can see, they're across the country. And then we look at who's actually done the baseline self-assessment toolkit. This is as of September. So you will know where your dot is or not is on this map. I don't know the individual organisations, but it is important that everyone goes through and does that baseline toolkit. Lastly, just a couple of slides from what the baseline assessments have shown. The first one is about whether you get prompt clinical assessment by a suitable consultant. And from the people who'd completed that baseline toolkit, you can see that only less than a third of hospitals felt that their patients who came in as emergencies had been seen by a relevant consultant within 14 hours of admission. So 2/3 were taking longer than that. Again, go back to what if it was you or your mum, what would you want in terms of consultant input? And then in terms of diagnostics, this is a busy slide and I apologise for that, but if we look particularly, let's look at MRI. So there are not very many indications for an emergency MRI, but when they do happen, they're really important. For example, someone who you think may have malignant spinal cord compression. And of course that can happen at any point in the week. And you can see blue is Monday to Friday, red is Saturday, green is Sunday, so that you can see only 30% of trusts who've completed the self-assessment say that it's possible to get an emergency MRI on a Saturday or a Sunday. Echocardiography, again, critically important for some patients, reasonably available in the week as you'd expect. But again, less than 40% can get an emergency echo done at the weekend. And for some patients, that may make a critical difference. So the self-assessment is important for the board to know about the quality and safety of care for their patients. And it's also something the CQC will want to see when they come round. David Levy gave me this next slide, which is his easy metric about the difference between weekday and weekend services. The car park on a Monday and the car park on a Sunday. Not that I'm recommending that everyone drives to work, although I know in some parts of the country you have to, but it's not because they've switched to bicycles, all right? Now, the one catch is that if we actually deliver all this in hospitals, we may just pull more work in. The public may say, well, we're not sure what the out-of-hours service is like in primary care, but we know our hospital's delivering 7-day service, so we'll be fine if we go there. So we do need to make sure we take forward work with primary, community and social services as well. And of course, we know social services already does work 7 days a week, as do community services, as do primary care. But it's different. It's hard to start a care package on a Saturday or a Sunday. Great example from Torbay. Everyone always hears about Torbay and there's eye rolling and so on, but I went down to look and see what they do. From the acute medical wards in Torbay, if someone is found to be ready to go home on a Saturday or Sunday, the discharge coordinator who is on the ward on Saturday or Sunday phones up social services and Mrs. So-and-so's going home, and the person on the other end of the phone says, right, we'll go in today and start an emergency care package, and then we'll go and see them in their home on Monday morning and see what's entirely appropriate from them for their on. And that's done without nurses and junior doctors filling in 15-page documents. It's done with a system that is reliable and works 7 days a week. The other way in which primary community care and social services can help is around averting admission. So I'll give you a personal example. My mother-in-law, who lives in Northamptonshire, had a fall. She's old, she's frail, she has early dementia. She just slipped off her chair onto the floor. The ambulance service and paramedics went in and saw her and said, oh, well, what you need is a chair raise. Your chair's too low. They checked that she hadn't got any serious injuries, and someone brought in one of those frames you put under a chair to raise the chair. The same day, it was a Sunday. I was pretty impressed. Now, the cost of that is not high, but if she'd had to go in as an emergency admission, it would have been completely different. So, the next steps. I've said that we need 7-day services plans within local health communities by March. We've talked about the NHS IQ toolkit, and you can see more about that outside. We know that TDA and Monitor are supporting this. We know that CQC are supporting this, and we're looking at the additional costs. Now, back of the envelope sounds like it's about 3% extra on the pay bill, assuming that we stay with the current contracts. And I'm not in a position to talk about contracts really, given that the BMA have just withdrawn from negotiating the consultant contract, and maybe Patrick can talk more about that. However, that costing has not factored in potential savings associated with preventing or rescuing people from deterioration. And some of the organisations that have put in 7-day services believe that they have made a saving. So there's some hope. So it's got to be clinically led. It really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We know it's the right thing to do for our patients, but it's also a difficult thing to do because we've got to work in the wider health economy. And in this part of the country, it's you that have got to deliver the change, and I'm really looking forward to you doing it. Thank you.